Hello and welcome to Lamestream, a show that guides you through the crisis in media and how it's impacting everything. I'm Osman Faruqi. I'm here with my co-host Scott Mitchell. Scott, how are you?
I'm good. I've got a question to ask you about a story I got a little obsessed with this week. You know that I have a guilty pleasure about a bit of celebrity gossip and the way that gossip gets reported in news organizations. One story that captivated me was, are you across the son of Posh Spice, Victoria Beckham, and David Beckham? This guy, Brooklyn. Are you across Brooklyn Beckham?
Scott. Look, I know that I may not be as diehard a Man U fan as you are, but you think there is some world in which you know about the celebrity child of Posh Spice and David Beckham, and I don't. I know Brooklyn. I know Romeo. I think there's a Cruz involved.
There is a
I'm
Cruz.
well into this family. I'm well into this family.
I believe Cruz is Cruz.
Like Leighton, right?
Yeah. But I would have preferred Cruz, as in Tom. But
As in
anyway,
Tom
I'm glad
Cruise.
you're across Brooklyn.
As in Speed 2 cruise control. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. I'm glad you're across the entire flock of Beckhams and their odd names. So this week he posted a series of Instagram stories and it kind of blew up the celebrity gossip pages. In it, he laid out this really essay about how he wants nothing to do with his famous parents anymore, Posh and Becks. And in a way, it was a pretty sad insight into what growing up with parents who get so much of their income through feeding the celebrity gossip machine must be actually like from the inside. And I found that all pretty interesting, I have to say. But that's not the question I have for people who are not obsessed with this story to the level I am. The question is, Brooklyn's Instagram essay ran for 820 words, Oz. It took up 6 story slides. You're a guy who posts some takes on Instagram, I think it's fair to say. You're not afraid of getting some text on story. As a, connoisseur of Instagram etiquette, how long is too long for an Instagram text statement?
I appreciate you referencing my tendency to post a lot on Instagram, particularly post on text. I think six full slides of text is like maybe 3 to 4 slides too many. I saw when this was being kind of aggregated and being shared by other influencer accounts, people had to like screenshot every single story and then kind of put a collage together. And you kind of just had this like wall of very hard to read text. I appreciate, Brooklyn had a lot of things to get off his chest. I feel like there's got to be a better way to do that, even in the social media age, even in the age of revealing information via Instagram story, than 6 full like text slides. It could have been some photos to break it up. Scott, you and I, we do posts on Instagram, Lamestream. We use graphic design software. I feel like the kids are pretty good at that. I'm sort of surprised that we just got just this many words from Brooklyn.
Yeah, or intersperse, put a snap of yourself in there from your wedding, which you're talking about. As with everything with word count, it's kind of about how interesting it is, right? And credit to Brooklyn here for actually revealing some facts and stories and information. I feel like that helps. And that kept me going longer than sort of the Notes app style apology statements that we got a lot of in the late 2010s, early 2020s, of just screenshots of the Notes app, which often were filled with completely meaningless statements. Maybe my favorite was Justin Timberlake's Notes app apology, where he was apologizing for basically just being a massive dickhead to both Janet Jackson and Britney Spears and a litany of other women. And it included the incredibly vague commitment to being, quote, part of a world that uplifts and supports.
Yeah,
not
sure.
Anyone, not uplifts and supports anyone in particular, just uplifts and supports all people. What a beautiful message. But yeah, I do miss the aesthetic from that era, though. I feel like, this one was very white text, black background, the Instagram standard font. I kind of miss the aesthetic of the Notes app apology. You sort of, as soon as you saw that, you're like, oh, what's gone down here? What has gone down
we're in
here?
for a ride here. I'm just surprised and sort of disappointed, Scott, that you don't want to go into the specifics of this particular feud. You know, it involves Victoria Beckham doing an inappropriate dance. Mark Anthony apparently is involved in this. I kind of
Yeah.
I kind of would love to know your very quick take on why you think the Beckhams don't like Brooklyn's wife, Nicole Peltz. You know, she's a billionaire heiress. Do they not like her father? Is it a political thing? You know, he's donated to Trump previously. Like, what's going on? Is it just a control thing? I mean, Nicole Peltz does have a reputation. She previously dated Anwar Hadid. She seems to like other rich scions. Like, what do you think is behind this?
Yeah, I mean, so people know that inappropriate dance. Brooklyn basically says that was supposed to be the first dance with his wife at his wedding. That was the moment. And then Victoria cut in with a surprise appearance from Mark Anthony and took the first dance with Brooklyn and did this weird grinding on him situation.
That is
I
some
think
brown mum stuff right there.
But I think that actually kind of speaks to the actual question, which is that, it does seem to me that it is basically about them wanting their kids to be part of brand Beckham and being kind of available for appearances with them, and that they sort of see her as she's independently wealthy, as you say. Brooklyn doesn't need the Beckham press machine and endorsement deal kind of pipeline to earn money anymore, and that they're sort of afraid that they'll like lose him as a prop in the Beckham Inc. kind of endorsement like world. And that seems to be why they're off her. It's kind of sad to me, given that, these are people who sort of, I think, I like David Beckham. I like Victoria Beckham. I think their kind of story is hilarious. I think their kind of background and where they came from is hilarious. I love that weird documentary about them. And so it's kind of sad if that the tension between his part of brand Beckham and then getting to be with somebody who's independently wealthy and doesn't need it anymore is the friction point.
It is sad, Scott. Thank you for sharing your thoughts on that.
More important issues coming up. Yeah.
Let's get into what we're going to be discussing today on the show. After recalling Parliament for an emergency session this week, the government has managed to pass a stripped-back version of its hate speech bill, which includes some of the most regressive crackdowns on speech and activism ever seen in this country. It also managed to pass new reforms to gun laws, despite the fact they were opposed by the coalition, marking an end to Australia's 30-year bipartisan commitment to gun reform. We'll take a close look at each of those laws and how the politics played out, as well as how the media worked overtime to ensure the Liberal Party backed the crackdown on speech, while giving them a pretty big free pass for adopting US-style rhetoric on gun control. Plus, we'll break down the extraordinary poll that shows One Nation has overtaken the coalition to become the second most popular party in Australia, and how that rise is influencing both the major parties' approach. Later in the show, we'll take a look at the US's increasing descent into authoritarianism, both domestically and on the international stage, including Donald Trump's announcement of the so-called Gaza Board of Peace, and why Australia still seems so eager to remain closely allied to the Trump regime.
Plus, in keeping tabs, I'm going to take a look at Bondi attack hero Ahmed Al-Ahmed's very strange summer and his world tour, his Instagram posting, and we're going to take a look at how Channel 9's broadcast partnership with the Australian Open could be impacting its paper's coverage of the event, and discuss the biggest story of the summer, AFL star Lachie Neale's marriage breakdown and how it's become a fixture of every single news outlet.
Before we get into all of that, a reminder that the best way to support this show is by becoming a subscriber to Lamestream. Not only do you get access to all of our articles and our weekly newsletter, you can also listen to this podcast ad-free and be the first to hear about our live events. Plus, we have some very exciting new subscriber-only offers that we'll be announcing very soon. So head to lamestream.com.au and subscribe right now. All right, so Scott, on Monday's episode, we discussed how the government's first attempt to ram through its big, controversial hate speech bill didn't get off the ground because of opposition from both the Greens and the Coalition. On Tuesday, this week, the government introduced two separate bills: a plan to reform gun laws and a stripped-back version of their hate speech legislation. This is their attempt to try to get some version of what they'd been promising after Bondi through the Parliament. The vast majority of the attention has been on the hate speech laws because, as we discussed in Monday's episode, the entire national political conversation since Bondi has absurdly focused on things like chants at pro-Palestine protests instead of things like terrorism and guns, the things that actually were behind the Bondi attack. We will discuss the hate speech laws later, but I want to talk about gun reform for a moment. The government's bill that passed the Senate on Tuesday night does a couple of things. It enables the planned gun buyback. So there are 4 million guns in circulation in Australia right now. That is 1 million more than were in the country before Port Arthur. And this gun buyback will allow the government to reduce that number. Secondly, the bill will also allow for greater background checks before someone obtains a gun license, including federal security checks from agencies like ASIO and the AFP. It was reported after the Bondi attack that one of the shooters, Naveed Akram, his father, the other shooter, was able to obtain a gun license, despite the fact that Naveed was on an ASIO watch list and the pair lived together. So the idea is that these laws will stop that by making sure there's information sharing between the state gun regulators and federal security agencies. And the last thing that the new laws do is make it harder to import certain guns. The kinds of guns, Scott, that you broke down for our listeners last year had become legal in Australia and were used in the Bondi attack.
Yeah. I wrote about it as well for the website, for the newsletter. And basically, these are guns, including a gun that was used by one of the Bondi shooters called a straight pull rifle that allows much quicker firing than was really available when our gun laws were first introduced after Port Arthur. I saw it as a way that gun companies were getting around the spirit of the Port Arthur laws, if not the letter. And there are even more concerning actions and faster firing actions than that, which are covered by this. I was kind of pleasantly surprised to see some federal regulation of this. And basically, these weapons will now face the same import controls as semi-automatic assault rifles, which means we won't see many more of them showing up in Australian gun shops. But it actually doesn't ban ownership of these guns, Oz. So all of the guns that have already been imported are fair game. They can keep being sold and owned in Australia, which is pretty concerning. And I think it's interesting that didn't get a whole lot of attention in the media coverage of this.
Yeah, and these reforms are just what the government can do at a federal level. There's still so much that different state governments can do to actually limit the amount of guns that people own. Or it's only one part of the conversation around gun reform. Now, as I mentioned, these laws did pass Parliament this week with the support of the Greens because they were opposed by the Coalition. And I want to discuss that for a second, Scott, because for our entire lives, right, since Port Arthur, Australians have talked about gun laws like they are a key part of the Australian national identity. Like whenever there is a mass shooting anywhere in the world, particularly in the US, everyone in Australia, regular people, columnists, newspaper editors, get on their high horse and say, well, thank God that could never happen in Australia because we've got this national consensus on gun control. We are a morally better country. We just don't believe in the right to bear arms. Yeah. And that is the reason why we don't have massacres in
We're
Australia.
The country that figured it out. Why can't everyone else? We did it.
Exactly. Now, as of this week, and really as of post-Bondi, bizarrely, that is not true. You mentioned, Scott, the story you wrote for us at the end of last year about how many holes there were in our gun laws, right? And there has been some commentary from gun reform experts saying, hey, it's kind of getting out of control. Like there are so many guns in Australia, we've got to do something about it. But it was just not a story that was picked up by most of the media or by most of the political parties. The Bondi attack, and I think this is really important to say, was conducted by entirely legally obtained firearms, right? So whatever gun control laws we have were not good enough to stop the worst terrorist attack on Australian soil. Despite that, almost immediately after that attack, there were claims in the media and from the conservative side of politics that talking about gun reform was a, quote, distraction from the real issue being the attempt to criminalize the pro-Palestine movement and make this entire thing about certain chants and language that was used. So we no longer have a national bipartisan agreement that gun control is good. And that agreement, to be very, very clear, has collapsed after a massacre where legal guns were used. So sorry to all Australians who think that we are like better than the US on this issue. We have somehow become exactly like the US on this issue, where there is a progressive versus conservative debate on whether guns are to blame for gun violence. The coalition, in particular the Nationals, have been using the exact same kind of rhetoric that the gun lobby in the US use, right? This idea that it's not guns that kill people, it's people that kill people. The Nationals have been using this line again and again. We don't have a gun problem, we have a radical Islam problem, right? Which is just like an even more racist version of that NRA line. In Queensland, the Liberal National Government there is actually refusing to participate in the gun buyback scheme that the federal government is trying to organize. The laws that the coalition's got, and I think this is quite extraordinary, the ones that they voted against, we ran through them. There's nothing in there that is actually about taking guns away from anyone forcibly. It doesn't impact the so-called, the base of the National Party, the farmers and the hunters that want their firearms so they can like shoot pests and shoot, wild species. They don't impact those people at all. They do things like make sure that there is an ASIO security check before you can get a gun license. I'm kind of flabbergasted that this is where Australia is, given how much Australians love to get on their high horse about this. I would love to know how you think, Scott, we got to a point where after a terror attack, the coalition could just abandon this national consensus on gun reform and not really face a real backlash to that.
Yeah, I mean, some of the rhetoric getting aired has been pretty disgraceful. I mean, the wildest one was probably Bob Catter. I know he's not part of the coalition, but his rant this week about how it's not about guns, it's people who come from countries that don't have a background in Christianity and religions like it, who come from countries that are not democratic, and that this somehow made them prone to picking up guns and shooting people. Some of the most horrific rhetoric from Catter.
And Bob Catter forgot that these people, the Middle East, where his family are from, had Christianity way before white people did.
I think part of the reason, Oz, that this has been able to be aired is that journalists have not really had to think about guns for 30 years. Like, none of them know what questions to ask. I saw a Sky News host ask David Shoebridge about what they called a fantastic analogy they'd heard from the pro-gun cam, that if you play golf, you need good clubs. And would these new gun laws take away the equivalent of good golf clubs from farmers and competitive shooters?
Completely crazy. That is completely
That's
crazy.
such a demented question, not least because you can still buy rifles that can take down a goddamn wildebeest, or it is not, these laws do not do anything to ban the kinds of rifles you need to manage a farm, control pests, target shoot, competitively shoot. As you say, it's stronger background checks, etc. Like, if a farmer is on a terror database, I think his level of pest control is the least of his worries. These laws are really about, so a shooter can't mow down 30 people before police respond to the scene. All the import things are about the rate of fire. And there's really no farming or competitive shooting reason to keep really high rates of fire. You don't need to be able to blow away 30 targets in a couple of minutes in any of those disciplines. But yeah, the coalition, particularly the Nationals, obviously, are just not treating this like a logical policy debate. They are talking about this as a culture war for regional voters and whipping up anxieties about government control, progressive elites, because they're paranoid about losing those voters, and they see it as kind of a wedge issue.
Yeah, you're totally right that they are whipping up anxieties. Like you saw in the past week, advocates for gun control kind of make the point that farmers are excluded from this legislation. Like, there's not a single thing that will impact farmers at all, unless they want to voluntarily give their guns to the government. They can keep whatever arsenals they've got. Yet this was framed as evil government coming in and taking guns away from regular people, which, let me just be very clear, I kind of don't care about farmers having the right to guns. Like, especially after a massacre like this, if that means there are some more rabbits on farms or deer or whatever, if that's the consequence of us taking guns out of the hands of people who may end up getting them to commit massacres, I feel like that is a fine price to pay. And I thought Australia was the kind of country where we were willing to do that because of how much we think gun control is important. It's just, again, pretty extraordinary to me that we couldn't even have a sane debate about it. And I think part of the reason why, like, the Nationals and the Liberals got away with breaking this consensus without much criticism or scrutiny at all, is because we're in this like weird political space at the moment where, even though most regular Australians don't engage with the mainstream media anymore, they treat it with contempt, they have very little trust for it. When it comes to our political class, right, on all sides, they pay heaps of attention. They take their cues from what the political press gallery writes. And gun reform was just not a focus of the journalists in Canberra. And I know that Canberra journalists, gallery journalists, tend to get very mad when you say that they have groupthink and they run the same line. And I've got a very simple response to them. Just stop running the same line. Like, if you want to stop being accused of that, stop all agreeing on the issues that matter. Like, if you go and read what any senior political correspondent had to say after Bondi, from The Guardian to the ABC to the Australian, it was the same stuff. It was almost line for line the same stuff, a parroting of the pro-Israel lobby. What needs to be done now is this crackdown on speech. The pro-Palestine movement needs to be the focus, not guns. We need to stop speech critical of Israel because that is what leads to attacks like Bondi. And part of the reason for that is it's really hard to think of any political journalist left in Australia or political editor that isn't basically enthralled to the pro-Israel lobby. There's like one person I was thinking of who has been relatively okay, but I'm not even totally convinced they're not enthralled to the Israel lobby, so I don't want to mention their name. But when the lobby mobilized very quickly after the Bondi attack to pressure the government to announce a royal commission on their terms, the media just ran their talking points. And the same thing, Scott, has happened on these hate speech reforms as well. The original draft of the bill, it's interesting, was met with such hostility that it looked like the whole thing could kind of fall over, right? The coalition didn't want it, the Greens didn't want it. But then when it looked like it was about to collapse, the Israel lobby kicked up again. It fought back. It piled all this pressure on the coalition, largely through the News Corp and Nine papers, the Age and Sydney Morning Herald, and basically pled with the coalition to do some kind of deal with Labor to make sure that some version of these laws that could criminalize the pro-Palestine movement did pass. And that's exactly what ended up happening. So it kind of is this combination of lobbying, a very captured political media, and an extremely, extremely weak PM who will just do what the media tell him to do eventually, that I think has gotten us to this point right now in Australian politics.
I'd just add to that, I'd emphasize that the balance of coverage thing is really interesting to me between gun laws and the hate group laws, right? Like, even if you look at it completely apolitically, right? Imagine, if you're someone out there who goes, look, I hear the concerns, but I trust these laws aren't going to be wrongfully used. They're just going to ban groups that I think need to be banned, like the NSN, and I am willing to wear that kind of cost to speech to ban those kind of groups, and I don't think it's going to do other things. Even if you believe that, right? Like, we have one set of laws, the gun laws, that are about the weapons that were literally in the hands of the Bondi shooter, the weapons that were used to commit the worst mass shooting in decades. And then we have a set of laws that are about hate groups, which neither of the Bondi shooters have any proven connection to. And what received the most coverage and the most interrogation, the most critique about whether we were doing the right thing and whether we were doing enough. Like, it is very interesting to me, even if you look at this apolitically, I think it's kind of unforgivable that the firearms legislation didn't get more proper coverage.
Okay, let's talk about the specifics of the hate speech bill that was passed. There are two main elements of what got through Parliament this week. The first is this new power that you ran through, Scott, on Monday. The government now has to designate an organisation a, quote, hate group. To do so, the government has to be satisfied that this group has directly engaged in conduct constituting a hate crime or advocated engaging in a hate crime. And the way that hate crime is defined, it can include things that could harm a section of the Australian community through social, economic, psychological, or physical manners. Now, the other main aspect of this bill...
And it's worth saying this wording has slightly changed from the weekend when we did our Monday episode. So you've just read the kind of latest wording of what has actually now become law.
That's right, yeah. The other main aspect of this bill are the new powers that have been handed to the Minister for Immigration. They make it much easier for them to deny visas to people if they have committed or advocated for hate crimes. Now, the key thing, Scott, is when you hear the word hate crime, it seems like, yeah, that's good. Why should we, not have a ban on people who want to commit hate crimes? Well, what this all hinges on is what is defined as a hate crime. And because that in this legislation is still so broad and so loose, it was opposed by most legal experts and civil liberties groups, including not radical people, quite boring, constitutional lawyers are saying this is so broadly defined, we think it's quite problematic. It's ultimately why the Greens ended up not supporting it. The concern specifically at the moment, in the context of how these laws are being passed, is that groups or individuals who criticize Israel, who accuse Israel of committing genocide, or who advocate for boycotts could be found under these laws to have committed a hate crime. And if that sounds like hyperbole to you, here's Michelle Rowland, the Attorney General, the most senior law officer in the country, being unable to rule out exactly that happening in an interview on the ABC on Tuesday night.
Would a group be banned if it accuses Israel of genocide or apartheid, and as a result, Jewish Australians do feel intimidated?
Well, there are a number of other factors that would need to be satisfied there. And what we seek to ensure with this legislation is that we give our investigative agencies like the AFP and also our intelligence agencies like ASIO the ability to be able to implement this law in a way that ensures that not only are we keeping Australians safe, but they are performing their responsibilities in terms of addressing anti-Semitism at its root causes.
So this is, I think this is a really important thing, Scott, to just sit on for a second, because this is exactly what the proponents of this bill want. And it has been drafted in a way that could allow it to happen. And people can say, well, I just can't see the Labor government doing that. Well, the Labor government's not going to be in government forever. Even if you assume best faith from them, which I don't know why we should. We've previously had people like Peter Dutton in the role of Home Affairs Minister, who gets to decide what is a hate group and what basis that definition is formed under. It's kind of pretty scary stuff that this was rushed through Parliament so quickly, I think, without proper scrutiny. The laws are so much more extreme than anything even Donald Trump has done in the US in terms of his attempts to crack down on criticism of Israel. And they passed Parliament through this really rushed process. It was just one day of parliamentary debate. And I think, as well as it just being bad lawmaking from a general perspective, I think the saddest thing is how much our parliament has just become a tool of the Israeli government, right? They set the terms. Benjamin Netanyahu himself intervened in the immediate aftermath of the Bondi attack to try to set the terms of what Australia debated. Their goal was to criminalize the pro-Palestine movement. They had the entire mainstream media on side to do that, and they managed to get Australian Parliament to rush through in one day of debate some of the most extreme laws that will crack down and criminalize speech and activism the country's ever seen. It's an extraordinary, extraordinary result.
On a slightly lighter side of this, but equally serious, I had a real chuckle that on the morning before this legislation was passed, it was Matt Canavan, of all people, the hard right pro-mining coalition senator, who raised this with Sally Sarah on RN Breakfast. And he asked why the term economic harm is in the definition of this hate offense, right? Economic harm isn't what most people think of with racist speech. And if it was a concern about genuine anti-Semitism, why is economic harm in there? And he asked rhetorically whether that meant that groups who were seeking to boycott Israeli imports or businesses, would they be covered? I mean, welcome to the resistance, Matt Canavan. Incredible. And Sarah later that morning played the grab to Roland later in the show. Michelle Roland was very uncomfortable in answering, which is why I think David Spears asked that question and pushed her much harder to be definitive about it on 7:30. But yeah, pretty concerning that Labor can't seem to rule that out.
Also, like, Labor is so stupid, and like the union movement is so like kind of pathetic at the moment. Do you know who causes economic harm as part of their like regular political strategy, Scott? The union movement, right? And you can argue that, oh, they wouldn't do it on the basis of like national ethnic origin. Well, like, yes, they would, and they should. You know, like, what was the union boycott of South Africa other than like a targeted campaign to cause that nation economic harm? We have just passed laws that not even potentially, like kind of by the letter of the law, make boycotts and strikes targeted at a particular country illegal, punishable with up to 15 years jail time. I think the consequences of this will probably end up making it a much bigger story than it is now because it's all being debated in the abstract. But as people start going to jail and groups like the Palestinian protest movement start being designated hate groups, I think you're going to see a lot more kind of real serious political debate about this, the kind of debate that should have been had before it was passed. The other political consideration that is sort of hanging over all of this, the gun reform, the hate speech legislation, is One Nation, Scott, and the role they are playing in our political system right now. We have been consistently warning about their rise pretty much from our very first episode last year. This week, there were a number of polls demonstrating an even bigger jump in their vote and a corresponding decrease in both the Coalition and Labor primary votes. The most significant of these polls was Newspoll, which showed that One Nation had overtaken the Coalition, polling 22% versus 21%. That is the first time in Australian history a minor party has overtaken a major party. Now, that is just one poll, Scott, but One Nation's vote is up in all the polls, and it's not just happening at the expense of the Coalition. Labor's primary is also dropping. William Bowe, an electoral analyst who writes at pollbudget.net, he does this really helpful aggregate of all the polls in the country to kind of get a sense of what's really going on. And that shows that since the last election, Labor's vote is down 5%, the Coalition's vote is down 6%, and One Nation is up 13%. So It's not just one poll. This is a massive, massive trend. And when you talk to Labor and Coalition people, they acknowledge that there are seats that are in play that they are worried about losing to One Nation. There's a Victorian state election later this year, and they are both worried about that. And they're also very anxious about the federal situation as well. And it's impacting how all parties are approaching issues like gun reform and hate speech. I think it's a big part of the reason why the Nationals, for example, took such a hard line against both bills. They are very, very anxious about One Nation, especially after Barnaby Joyce's defection. But it is not just the Conservatives freaking out. Like, this got missed a little bit in the kind of heated debate immediately after Bondi. When New South Wales, Labor government, passed restrictions on how many guns people could own after Bondi, the federal Labor MP for the Hunter, Dan Repacholi, slammed that decision and wrote on social media, "Shame on the New South Wales government." Now, the key opponent to Dan Repacholi instead of Hunter is One Nation.
Yeah, you look at the way that Labor people are reacting to this rise, and it starts at the top, obviously, with Albanese. He was asked about this latest polling by Jackie O, of all people. I'm Kyle and Jackie O. And he said, "I'll say something nice about the other side. I'm a believer in mainstream politics and the parties of government. It's important. It served this country well," obviously referring to the Coalition. And he basically went on to say he doesn't want a country where that there are, 5, 6 parties needing to form coalition governments, like in some European countries, and all the kind of chaos that comes with that, and said the Coalition need to deal with this rise in One Nation, and basically implied, they need to maintain the two-party system. As a response to this threat of a far-right party like One Nation, I just cannot imagine a worse rhetorical line from Albanese, if that is who the Labor Party are taking their cues from about this. It's pretty accepted across the entire world and political science that these far-right parties are rising, not because people agree with specific policy points, but because
Yeah.
people are just angry at the status quo. It's not delivering for them their jobs, homes, services, the amount of free time they have. All of these indicators are going backwards, no matter which major party that they elect. And the idea that there's some constituency out there for Albanese who are like, oh, I'm filled with rage and was going to vote for One Nation, and then I heard Albo tell Jackie O about the merits of the two-party system and how safe and balanced it is, and it changed my mind. Like, that is living in absolute fantasy land as a way to counter the threat of this.
Yeah, it's really worrying that that is what Albanese thinks is the answer. It's like you are feeding this by not doing enough to make people feel comfortable, by presiding over, record increases in house prices, the cost of education, the cost of medicine. You can't just do all that, watch your vote collapse and be like, oh, but it's really important to vote for major parties because we're the ones that do government. It's like, that's not going to work, dude. It's not working anywhere in the world. It's not going to work in Australia either. For so much of the last year, Scott, we have been kind of tearing our hair out and saying, One Nation is on track to do what Reform in the UK did and potentially become the biggest party in the country, and sort of saying, why aren't people talking about it? Well, finally they've cottoned onto it, but I kind of wish that they hadn't, right? I sort of take back everything I said because I assumed that would then lead to the kind of scrutiny that the media applies to parties like Labor, the Coalition, the Greens. But that hasn't happened. Instead, in response to the fact that a far-right party is on track potentially to become the main opposition or even the government, they've all decided to write the softest possible pieces on One Nation and on Hanson. So after this news poll result, Hanson predictably did a press conference and said, I'm ready to govern. And that just led to every news outlet running stories like, Hanson says she's ready to govern. And all they did was regurgitate everything she said without any scrutiny, without any attempt to explore the obvious hypocrisies and contradictions in how she operates and what One Nation promises. For an example, here's what news.com.au said after that press conference. Hanson says the Bondi massacre was a wake-up call over mass migration.
Oh.
And then quoting her, it is about Islam. It is about people that we bring into the country. They're not people compatible or suitable for this country. That was an example of that piece and most of the pieces that wrote about her. They just provided space for her insane rhetoric, right? And one that really stood out to me was by the ABC's chief digital political correspondent, Claire Armstrong. She's part of this wave of News Corp acolytes that have kind of basically totally taken over the ABC's political wing. She wrote this completely inane article this week. It was titled, Hanson Celebrates Rise in Polls. This piece had zero analysis of Hanson's policies, what the impact of a far-right surge would be in Parliament, like what it would mean for any potential government to have an increase in One Nation MPs in the Senate and the lower house. No analysis of what it would mean for policy in this country. It again just quoted One Nation and Hanson talking up their chances at winning seats at upcoming elections. It was terrible, and I think it sums up where ABC analysis is right now. It's dull, meaningless, and if it has any impact at all, it is to just boost the right, either accidentally or on purpose. But it was pretty typical of how the media covered Hanson this week. And I think, Scott, I want to ask you what you think is going on here, because I'm not totally sure it's a deliberate strategy by news editors to actively pump up One Nation, but it is the approach that you would take if you were trying to actively pump up One Nation. So how do we get to this point? What's going on?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think it is a bit of a symptom of, the lack of resourcing and how busy journalists are, but then also the kind of people who have been selected to kind of rise to those positions and rise to the chief political reporter kind of ranks. And it's that I think because of the lack of time and also the type of people, they are not particularly interested or engaged in the historical lessons of the rise of the far right or the ideological, philosophical division of ideas where these parties are vulnerable, the falseness of their promises. They're not really across that. They're far more interested in just Hanson calls a press conference, says this, the Prime Minister says she's that. And that's really their level of interest and analysis. I mean, it is fascinating that, it really feels like they are still on day one of the Rise in One Nation story. Like, you are just seeing the comparisons to Reform UK, something that I think we brought up, when One Nation first hit 12%. And even back then, I'd say we were still grappling with the higher level dangers with a lot more clarity than we're seeing from the media now. And they've just got there. If One Nation really are surpassing the coalition, it would seem to me, we need pretty urgently for the media to be asking questions like about their backing from billionaires like Gina Reinhart, whether they really represent working people's concerns, to really forensically engage with this, find out, are they engaging in any underhanded, less than honest strategies? Treating this with seriousness instead of getting wrapped up in, the coverage that has largely been like, wacky Pauline Hanson gets her moment in the spotlight. Can she stick the landing? Does she have enough political experience? Who knows? I mean, it just is a bit gross when the stakes are this high.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it is also really telling how much the political media are willing to ask tough questions and how much the media is willing to ask tough questions and kind of offer scrutiny to a minor party on the left, like the Greens, and like how tough they go on them. And like they should, their political party deserves scrutiny. But that same kind of approach just isn't there with One Nation. And, could it be because, I think that potentially for a lot of political journalists, for a lot of journalists, for a lot of editors in Australia, even if they don't actively want One Nation to win, they are less threatened by what One Nation offer because they are like largely wealthy conservative white people than they are by a party on the left. I think that is a big part of what's going on as well. All right, coming up after the break, we'll take a look at the US's continued spiraling into authoritarianism, including Donald Trump's plan for a board of peace in Gaza and why Australia still won't break free.
Oz, maybe the biggest story in the world since we've been off over summer has been the Trump administration spiraling into its most authoritarian, most fascistic tendencies. There's been the kidnap of Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro, the increasingly disturbing stories about ICE, particularly them shooting dead an unarmed woman behind the wheel of a car in Minnesota, but also everything going on in Minnesota, these street battles with protesters. There's been this incredible stuff on display across all of our feeds in videos from Minnesota, this mix of the sort of racist profiling and arrogance on show from ICE, but also total ineptitude at the same time. There have been reports of ICE agents leaving cars in the middle of the road without the handbrake on so they can just roll forward through the street with no one behind the wheel. I've seen reports of flashbang grenades and assault rifle ammunition just discarded and left on the street for anyone to pick up after ICE has been on a scene. It's wild, wild stuff. I think it's all emblematic of a turning point in Trump's presidency, and it actually has huge implications for Australia and Australians. We continue to deepen this alliance with the US. This is a country that Penny Wong and Anthony Albanese say we are defending international law alongside, maintaining norms and peace. But over the summer, the Trump administration really appears to be giving no fucks anymore. Oz, they are pursuing their enemies with maximum vindictiveness, maximum force. There are absolutely no apologies made. And that is probably best illustrated by this week's big news, Trump's accelerating plans to take over Greenland. Oz, I think when this story first started surfacing, probably a year ago now, it was a comedy story, really. It was a kind of what the fuck story. And now we're sitting here today and it's on a knife's edge. The US-European alliance could be torn up. There could be a huge economic crisis and sanctions and tariffs. How strange has it been for you to watch this go from a comedy yarn to such a kind of high-stakes moment in global politics?
Yeah, it's been interesting watching this turn, particularly in Europe. Like for most of the first year of the Trump presidency, as he kind of wielded the power of the US state to push his agenda, whether that was economically through tariffs or militarily through strikes, on Iran and on these Venezuelan boats, everyone who pretended to care about international law, including the EU, continued to suck up to them. And I guess they figured that the Greenland stuff was just this like weird aside and he wouldn't really care about it. Like even as recently as the kidnapping of Maduro, the EU, the best they could do was put out this piss-weak statement that refused to condemn what was very clearly an illegal act. Like they couldn't muster up the courage to say, hey dude, kidnapping a head of state is like pretty bad. But that has changed in the past week, right? The deference to Trump has really started to weaken as it's become clear this Greenland thing is very serious. We've seen European countries issue statements opposing it. Messages between Trump and other European leaders have been leaked, which suggests that tensions are pretty high. It does feel like it's a potential turning point, and honestly, it feels like one that is necessary because the alternative was just like watching this unstoppable fascist US regime remake the world in its own image, and it looked like no one had the courage to sort of say no. Now it looks like at least out of self-interest, the Europeans are waking up and realizing that this is all very serious.
Yeah, to talk about the media coverage of this, I mean, if anyone doubts how real a threat this is, it is shocking to go over and listen to just how committed right-wing commentators are to the US taking over Greenland. If you listen to Fox News or Sky News Australia here, all of those people are talking about this like it's inevitable, like it's already been decided the US is taking over Greenland. Here's a former Trump official talking to Fox News just a couple of days ago.
So the president is, of course, dead set on acquiring Greenland and even announcing tariffs on European countries. And those European countries are dead set against this, and they're going to be holding this emergency summit today over what the heck to do. So what happens next?
Well, thanks for having me, Carly. I think our European friends really need to step back from this performative domestic politics that they're engaged in and realize that this is about a core interest of the United States. Greenland's a part of the Western Hemisphere.
You know, there they are talking like this is done. It is the Europeans who are being aggressive in trying to maintain Greenland's sovereignty. And they may well be right to be talking about that. You know, you mentioned these leaked text messages. One to the Norwegian Prime Minister from Donald Trump said, you know, Trump said he was doing this because he didn't get the Nobel Peace Prize. He said Denmark had no written documents that showed Greenland was its territory. That's, of course, wrong. And that, like, the world would not be safe until the US had, quote, complete and total control of Greenland. Trump's now, you know, threatening tariffs against all of Europe to try and force a handover. The Europeans are considering massive retaliation, potentially banning US banks from access to European markets. And that could be a genuine global economic crisis, Oz, that affects, you know, all of our supers and all of our wealth here in Australia. And it's important for Australia for another reason, because, Oz, to me, it raises this question of what exactly is the reward for being a Trump ally or for sucking up to this administration? The Europeans, as you say, have tried. They've folded a bunch to his demands over the last year, and this is how they're rewarded, by Trump wanting to seize European territory. We know that Australia has been placating Trump and that some of this has leaked out, but the Labor government has been going out of its way to make sure that there is nothing that could upset Trump. There's been huge efforts going on behind the scenes. You know, even I've been told of some to control every level of government and Australia's messaging on Trump and what's said publicly about Trump. And, you know, you look at how Penny Wong this week has responded to this Greenland story. Here's what she told Seven's Sunrise program on Wednesday morning.
Does it concern you that the US president says he no longer feels obliged to think purely of peace?
Good morning, David. Good morning, Nat. Well, what I'd say first is in relation to Greenland, our position, Australia's position, is very clearly that the future of Greenland is a matter for the people of Greenland and for Denmark. But more broadly, if I can go to what you included in your question, the stability and peace of the post-war period has been in large part due to the stability between, the alliance between, the cooperation between the United States and Europe. So in terms of Australia's national interests, which is what I always have to look to, we will always argue for that stability and cooperation and that alliance to be maintained.
Oz, Penny Wong makes the case there that the US protects middle powers like Australia and like upholds our rights. We have a Western ally, a middle power like Australia, Denmark, being trampled on and their territory seized, what is the point of placating Trump and Australia going along with this when he's doing this to a country in a very similar position to Australia?
It is so pathetic seeing how cucked Australia is by Trump. And in so many ways, our position is worse, right? Like, at least the EU has the NATO alliance, which is a pretty rigid historical alliance that commits, collective defense. We don't even have anything like that actually guarantees that the US should come to our rescue if something happens. But nevertheless, we are still giving Trump like $1 trillion under AUKUS. It is a terrible situation that we are in, and it is embarrassing to see the government still cling so strongly to it. Like, again, kind of like the gun reform stuff. It is so funny that people in Australia think that we are morally or politically superior to the US when people used to joke about John Howard turning Australia into a client state to the US. That is happening turbocharged under Anthony Albanese. And if you think that we're better than the US, where are the mass constant protests over the fact that our government is so closely aligning itself to the US financially and militarily at the exact same time that it is morphing into such an authoritarian fascist state? Like, we are closer to them than ever under a Labor government.
And I want to stay with this idea of the Australia-US alliance, but turn to another part of Trump's summer spiral into greater and greater authoritarianism, which is Trump's Gaza Peace Board, Oz. A full draft text of the board's charter was leaked and published by Bloomberg. Last year, the UN voted to approve it, so this is really happening. This is not an idea anymore. It is happening. Yeah. And so the structure of this that we've learned is there will be an overall peace board with Trump as the chair, a position he'll be able to keep for life if he wants to, and he'll have total power to make any changes he wants to the organization that runs Gaza. Total power. Underneath the peace board he sits on is what is called an executive board with people like Jared Kushner, his son-in-law, and Marco Rubio on it. And then beneath that is a temporary authority over Gaza, which will kind of function as a government, and that's supposed to be filled with Palestinian and Arab kind of technocrats. But Trump has invited Anthony Albanese to join the overall board, which Trump chairs. This is completely insane, Oz, that this is even a possibility that Albanese will be on this board. The Australian media have been pretty dismal on this. It's ranged from the Daily Oz, their Instagram tile summary of this. What a pithy, easy way to understand the issues. It basically, to me, this explainer could have come from the US State Department. It talked about how Mahmoud Abbas, the president of the Palestinian Authority, welcomed the board and was really excited about it. I mean, A, he's over a barrel. B, he's been a US client for, the last 20 years. But anyway, and talked about how, the people on the board will have so much diplomatic experience. It was so...
Yeah, Jared Kushner. Yeah, sure.
Jared Kushner, exactly. It was so sort of filled with lines, and there was a couple of bits of balance in there, but overall could have been drafted by the Trump State Department, I'd say. The more critical coverage... mostly focused on the fact Albanese would have to sit alongside some pretty uncomfortable bedfellows on this board, people like Vladimir Putin, if everyone who's been invited accepts. And given that Australia has declared Putin a war criminal, that could make for some uneasy meetings. But still, to me, all of that is a sideshow, even that critical coverage. Something I haven't seen many in the media ask is, what legal responsibility would Albanese be taking on if he accepts this appointment? The situation in Gaza, even before October 7, is unlawful. The blockading of it, holding the population hostage, denying the free entry of food and aid. Then after the ceasefire, you still have the Israeli military killing people with impunity.
Yeah.
Let alone then what someone like Albanese would be responsible for from what the board actually enacts. Will they forcibly acquire Gazan land for redevelopment for Trump Gaza? Will security forces that they oversee commit crimes? If the security forces, these are armed foreigners in Gaza, they could kill people. They could unlawfully kidnap, detain people, torture them. It's hard to see that kind of thing not happening. So could someone like Albanese or the Australian government more broadly be liable for that under international law, have
Yeah, that's a
cases
good question.
at the International Criminal Court? I have to say,
All
good on
happening today.
Meher Maghrabi at the Nine newspapers for being one of the only Australian journalists to get into this in a piece where he described signing on as basically endorsing a mafia world order where Trump plays landlord over Gaza.
Yeah, shut
But
up,
I
Meher.
was like, stepping back, the idea that we're even under pressure to accept this invitation, like France rejected it. Macron said he won't sit on it. I imagine because of some of these concerns, why can't Australia and Albanese just reject this outright?
I mean, that's a great question. Like, Albanese's response to being invited was so pathetic. He was like, we haven't had time to consider it. I think it came in overnight. I'll take my time and give it proper consideration. I mean, we know what they're scared of, right? Like, they've aligned themselves so closely to the US rather than developing independent foreign policy objectives, independent economic policy objectives. They've just decided that we're going to align ourselves with this fickle guy, which then means we have to treat him with respect, even though his plans are demented and evil. That is a choice that the Albanese government has made. Other countries, like France, as you just mentioned, have decided to not align themselves this closely with the US. It shows how frightened the Australian government is of taking any stance that could be perceived as being hostile to Trump. So what's going to happen here? Like, are they going to not participate and potentially piss Trump off, or are we going to be part of this? You know, it's really remarkable that that could be a real live possibility here. And there are concerns that go beyond just what is happening in Gaza, which is obviously a massive, massive concern in and of itself. But there are reports that what Trump is trying to do is use this board of peace to create a kind of alternate shadow UN, because he just hates the UN so much. I just can't see why the Australian government can't say that is bad and we don't want to be a part of it. It really, I think, reveals just how tied to the US, and not just the US, tied specifically to the far-right presidency of Donald Trump this country is right now.
Yeah, I think what is terrifying about it is if Albanese is so afraid of anything that could vaguely insult Trump, he doesn't want to say, because tariffs could mean that farmers get mad at Albanese or small businesses or whatever, that if he puts tariffs on Australian beef and cotton and whatever else and steel, that will be bad for Albanese. If he's so concerned about that he won't say this, and that the Australian government will advise people, make it policy to not say anything negative about Trump.
Yeah.
What does that say about the spread of fascism? If we won't, if we are self-censoring ourselves to just stick up for the rule of law or say that some of these things are crazy, we are acquiescing to that far-right authoritarian fascist ideals. Even if we're doing it for Albanese is doing it to protect his own political fortunes and protect Australian exporters, you're still letting Trump dictate what this country says. That is just crazy to me.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, after the break, we'll take a look at the global adventures of Bondi hero Ahmed Al Ahmed and how Nine's partnership with the Australian Open seems to be impacting its coverage of the tournament. And finally, our take on the Lachie Neale saga that everyone's been talking about this summer.
Oz, obviously a funny thing about the modern social media age is the way that we can follow any public figure, have access to them directly, not hear it through the news, and we can really follow everything they get up to. I wanted to talk a bit about the summer that Bondi hero Ahmed Al Ahmed has had. He obviously... I think it's been fascinating that the whole of Australia has kind of followed him as he went to the Sydney Test match on the field for a moment of silence, but we also got to see him hanging out in the members bar during the game. He traveled to the US, met Jewish community leaders in New York. He actually had dinner with M. Night Shyamalan. What a twist of itself. Who would have seen that coming? And he got a face-to-face meeting with Zoran Mamdani. But we have seen again and again how social media attention can turn on people and be really damaging, I think, for their
Yeah.
psyches, really, when they're thrust into fame in the social media age. And this week, Al Ahmed shared a pretty heartfelt message where he said he'd been copying criticism for the benefits he'd had from his sudden celebrity as a hero. He'd received a lot of awful messages, and he talked about copying that while still dealing with his recovery, and revealed that doctors say he may never get movement back in his hand after being shot 5 times. A bit of background to this statement, Oz, for people who haven't followed his summer. He sort of has copped criticism from all directions. In New York, reporters threw a question at him about whether he wanted to meet Trump, and he replied that he's a hero of the world, which led to News Corp enthusiastically writing this up, and then some progressives kind of posting nasty comments about how disappointed they were that he's a Trumper and close to Trump and things. Meanwhile, right-wingers have been also trying to milkshake duck him and posted these really slanderous and racist things about his background and being Syrian. So far, I don't think any of it has really stuck to Al Ahmed, I would say. I'm sure it's horrible to receive, but I don't think it's dented his reputation. But what do you think about this? Is there this kind of, I don't know, desire in some parts of the public to see a guy like Al Ahmed get milkshake ducked, some weird pathology where people want to see his reputation flipped?
Do you know what? I don't know if most normal people want that. I think most normal people are just like, this guy's a hero and all the best. But I do think that there are sections of the media that will love to expose him. Like, it's just like the media loves doing this. They love building someone into a figure way beyond what they could be, like as just like a regular person who happened to do a pretty remarkable thing, and they love tearing that person down. I can't remember if we talked about this immediately after Bondi, but one of the most senior, high-profile reporters at the Sydney Morning Herald was sharing court records that mentioned Ahmed Al Ahmed in the company Slack, literally like the day after Bondi, in what looked like an attempt to try to milkshake duck him immediately. So there is this tendency in the media to be like, ooh, you all like this person? Well, here's some stuff about them that might make you think twice. I kind of am just like a bit confused by his national tour, if I'm allowed to say that. Like, I'm not telling him what he can and can't do, but I'm not really sure what he's up to, like why he thinks visiting like the US Republican speaker is helpful. I have a theory that perhaps he's trying to get citizenship. Like, he does not have Australian citizenship, and it's interesting that the Australian government didn't give it to him. Like, they gave citizenship to, I think, a couple of French people after the Bondi stabbing attack. They haven't confirmed that he's going to get citizenship. So I wonder whether his US tour is an attempt to get US citizenship. I don't know, but it is interesting to see him meet all sorts of people across the political spectrum in the US.
Yeah, I think the way I come down on this is, you know, a regular guy, someone who's worked in a fruit shop in the past, who wrestles the gun out of someone's hand during the worst massacre in decades. Like, he doesn't have to have perfect opinions or a perfect history.
Totally.
Like,
Yeah.
I think he's not claiming to lead a social movement or to be a politician. And I think it's sort of bewildering when people hold people like this to that standard. You know, to me, him saying something positive about Trump, I think he's just a guy who senses his moment and like wants the tour, wants the free lunch, wants to be able to show his grandkids a photo of the time he met a US president. And he knows
he
that
wants to get on the
Trump a
board of
shout
peace
out,
for Gaza. You know, let him have a crack.
he might. And he kind of probably knows that giving Trump a shout out is the fastest road to that, right?
Yeah.
So
totally.
I say, like, get it, bro. Like, get the photo ops, like, do whatever you want, like, go for it. I'd probably do the same thing if I was in his position. The one thing I did want to mention that I was so fascinated about his summer, and it's probably the most embarrassing attempt to go after him in the months since, was this Sky News Australia article, Oz, written by not a reporter, not a journalist, but an executive at Sky News Australia, the head of programming, Mark Calvert, who insisted on publishing an article about how Al Ahmed had agreed to give them the exclusive sit-down interview and then ghosted on it. Basically, what happened was the network thought that they had the world exclusive, and reading the article, Calvert goes on and on about how much they gave him to secure it, a room at Crown, all of this stuff. But then buried in there is that the room at Crown was comped. Sky News didn't pay for it. It cost them nothing. and that Al Ahmed backed out and ghosted them after being forced to have breakfast with Sharry Markson, and instead told his story to Australian reporter Anna Corrin, who now is with CBS News America, and she ended up getting the first exclusive. I mean, first of all, good choice to go with Anna over Sharry. I think it's so funny that in this article, Calvert outed that Al Ahmed's decision came after he had breakfast with Sharry. Like, the idea he sat down for a coffee and some scrambled eggs and was like, fuck, no way I'm talking to this chick, is pretty funny timeline of events.
Yeah.
And second, and the bigger thing was, it is so embarrassing for Sky News and everyone there that a senior executive has a big cry and a whinge publicly about how he got beat at checkbook journalism. Like, you want to play the game of paying for an interview or giving someone in exchange for access? Guess what? You lost. You played the dirty game and you lost. And having a giant public sook and a cry and trying to use that to damage Al Ahmed's reputation is so embarrassing to me. Like, what happened to commercial TV execs Oz? You know, they played it dirty, but at least they sort of had a honesty about playing it dirty. It's a cutthroat, competitive world of douchebaggery. Own that. Don't become a giant baby who throws your toys out of the pram if you lose that game.
Yeah, at the least it will make someone think twice before they want to play this game with Sky News, right? If that's the way they treat you, if you don't give them what they want. In that piece, I thought it was also pretty revealing that Calvert was like, we missed an opportunity to ask Ahmed Al-Ahmed all these questions about, what he thinks about the rising anti-Semitism crisis in Australia. Like, fucking no wonder this guy didn't want to do an interview. What does he know about that? What has he got to say about that? That is,
or like
of any
Islamism
interest or merit?
in Syria post the civil war and stuff. You're like, he's not a geostrategic expert, pal. You're clearly trying to just stump him. But shout out to the doves that Sky News apparently bought, according to this article, so that Al Ahmed and Sharry could release them together at Bondi. I do wonder what happened to the doves.
Scott, a couple of sports things to touch on as we round out this episode. I am a big fan of the Australian Open. I've gone every year to the tournament since I've lived in Melbourne. It's one of my favourite sporting fixtures in this country, and it's a fun 2 weeks where everyone in Australia pretends to care about tennis and gets behind Aussie hopefuls who inevitably get knocked out in the first week, and then we all watch Novak Djokovic win the final and move on with our lives. It's a great Australian tradition. Channel 9 has had the broadcast rights to the Open since 2019, but over time, particularly in the last couple of years, it's been really interesting to watch how that broadcast partnership, TV partnership, has become more and more integrated with the 9 papers, The Age and the Sydney Morning Herald. And something I've noticed over the last couple of years across a number of Nine's partnerships, it used to be the case Nine would do it as like a TV station and the papers were independent and sort of didn't really overlap. But increasingly now, these partnerships are marketed and sold to both the partners and the public as this company-wide thing. So if you partner with Nine, you get us on TV, you get us on radio, and you get us in these big, important print and digital outlets as well. Now, why is this important? Well, I mean, obviously, being a commercial partner of an organization that's big and powerful has impacts on how you may cover them. No one really expected Nine News to do hard-hitting journalism on the institutions that it has commercial relationships with, like whether it's the NRL or whether it's a body like Tennis Australia. But I think they do expect it from papers like The Age and the Sydney Morning Herald. And if it's the case that those papers are increasingly becoming platforms that are commercially tied to those institutions and are there to promote them and to promote Nine's broadcast relationship with them, what impact could that have on their ability to fearlessly report on them? That's kind of the key question here. And one thing that has really stood out to me in the last couple of years with the tennis is how much the papers are just now dedicated to relentlessly plugging the Australian Open. On Sunday, the first day of the AO, I counted 6 stories on the Age and SMH homepage about the Australian Open. That is 1/3 of the homepage dedicated to that event. And there's just no way that would be the volume of coverage that was being pumped out without that partnership. And obviously every story on the homepage that is about the Australian Open is a story that's not being promoted about anything else happening in the world or in Australia that is of consequence. And most of those stories also included promotional links to stream the event on Stan, which is also owned by Nine. The Australian Open live blog this year is sponsored by a brand, Ralph Lauren, who is also an official partner of the Australian Open. It's all very, very commercial stuff from a couple of newspapers that claim they are independent always. And as well as that, for the past 4 years, The Good Weekend, one of the last few remaining sort of prestige news magazines in the country, has quite literally turned into an ad for the Australian Open ahead of the tournament. And Nine now explicitly plugs that in its sales partnerships. It says that this is like part of what you get for partnering with Nine is you get the Good Weekend turned into a magazine for you. It's another example, I think, of really quality journalism being sold to the highest bidder. This traditional idea of there being a Chinese wall between commercial partnerships and journalism is kind of out the window when you're selling off rights to your live blog and promoting things as blatantly as this. Now, there's still some interesting stories being published about the AO. There was one story in particular by The Age's reporter Patrick Hatch on whether the AO delivers value for money for Victorian taxpayers, which was an interesting read, but even that had like a logo and a link to watch the AO on Stan right at the very top, which if you're like an average punter, it kind of does give off this impression of a commercial partnership and sort of suggestion of a potential conflict there. One of the biggest narratives that's emerging from the Open this year, I don't know if you've seen this, Scott, is like how crowded the venue is. It seems like the organisers, Tennis Australia, have sold more and more tickets and perhaps ruining the fan experience to chase dollars. One thing I'm interested in observing is whether or not the Nine papers actually go into that at all, or whether it's just like the relentless pro Tennis Australia stuff that we've seen from them so far. I don't know how much of this you've followed or whether you think it's a big deal at all. Maybe I'm being too precious about my imaginary era of journalism where we keep these things separate.
No, I think it is a big deal. I'd even say over on actual Channel 9, it's been so weird that this year the commentators are referring to the activations and how exciting all of the activations are. These are pavilions, sort of bars, giveaways that are run by various corporate sponsors that if you go down, you can go into these bars and they're all branded. It is so weird to me that they are not only talking about them heaps, but using like the alien corporate language of calling them activations and not being the bars that you can go to. And people might be like, oh, well, don't commentators flog stuff all the time? I do think that, these are cultural experiences in our lives. I sort of hate the idea if they are being handed a note to say they need to mention the activation so many times during each match. It's a bit gross.
Yeah, just on the branded partnerships, there's one that has always frustrated me, 1573, which is this like Chinese liquor, which is like a big part of the AO. If you're watching again, you can see it there. You can't buy this drink anywhere at the Australian Open.
I believe it's some kind of Chinese liqueur, but you can't even buy it here.
It looks delicious, but it's like, if you're going to shove it in my face every time I go to the tennis or watch the tennis, let me go to a activation of this thing and drink it. To be clear, we are not being sponsored by 1573 liquor. This is just me.
Yeah, the good people at Guazhou 1573, though, if they could send a sampler, I would love to try your product.
We're happy to sell off the rights to our live blog to Guazhou 1573. All right, Scott. This is a story that people have been really waiting for us to weigh in on. We're giving it to them the very end of this episode, the Lockie Neal saga. Now, this is one of those stories where everyone pretends to take the high moral ground. They say they don't care, but secretly they're reading every story they can. Every single person I have interacted with since coming back to this country at the beginning of the year, even the people who I think wouldn't care about this story, know every single detail about it, right? This is kind of reach.
I got texts this week from friends being like, I don't follow AFL. Why is Lockie Neal across every homepage and my Instagram and what the hell is going on? Yeah, it's everywhere.
Monoculture is back, baby. The recap quickly is that Lockie Neal, who was captain of the Brisbane Lions, who won the AFL Premiership last year, he was caught having an affair with his wife's best friend. Now, when that emerged, he did this press conference and resigned his captaincy of the club. His marriage has since disintegrated, as has the marriage of the woman he was having the affair with. And as you mentioned, Scott, the story's been everywhere, all over someone, every news homepage, particularly news.com.au and the Daily Mail, but even outlets like The Age weighed in with an opinion piece on, how these things should go. the coverage is so relentless. Like even now, weeks after the incident and Neil's resignation, you can Google Lachie Neale every day and there'll be 5 news stories that pop up. Like just today, for example, I Googled it and the Herald Sun has a story with pictures about the woman he had the affair with taking out her bins, right? That's like the level we're at
Breaking.
now with this story.
Yeah, breaking.
stuff.
Affair partner takes out bins. Incredible.
I would argue, Scott, I'm really keen to get your take on this. Whatever public interest there was in this story, I think it has long since evaporated. Like we're now just following breathlessly the daily movements of every character in this saga, even though the vast majority of them are not public figures. And even Neil, I mean, he's a public figure insofar as he plays football, but he's like not a politician. He's not claiming any kind of moral authority or anything like that here. There is really barely a scandal. You know, there's no allegations of criminality or impropriety. Like 2 marriages have broken down. That's literally it. And I was kind of thinking, like, how did we end up here as a culture? It's just really hard not to see the amount of coverage and the tenor of the coverage, the interest in this being anything other than a reflection of like how we are in this post-reality TV, post-maths kind of moment where every single thing is treated like an episode of Real Housewives, and even to an extent like the individuals involved lean into it when they post cryptic social media statements, when they, you know, choose to wear certain things, whether they tip off the press, whether they tip off paparazzis, all that sort of stuff. It's a very, very, very strange kind of cultural atmosphere that we're in right now. My question for you is, like, is this a real scandal? Was it a valid story? Has it gone too far? Are you loving all of it? What do you reckon?
Despite saying how much I'm into celebrity gossip, yeah, I think it's gone way too far. And the thing I'm very uncomfortable with is behind both this and a few other big stories in the last year, there's this creeping sense of kind of moralism about it, and the media and the public sort of finger wagging and being really moralistic in a way that I don't think we would have even 10 or 20 years ago. Like it feels in some ways we are more uptight about infidelity and things than we would have been. As you say, it's like there's no allegation of sort of abuse here or anything like that. It is straight infidelity story, which I think at a certain time we would have treated as like, oh, well, no one wants to be cheated on. You don't want it to happen to you. But, you know, these things happen. It doesn't make anyone necessarily like a bad person. I think sort of the unfortunate thing that happened here for Lachie Neale and really everyone involved is because he resigned that co-captaincy, as you said, it sort of allowed the media to justify this crazy level of coverage because they could go, well, it's a legitimate news story. It's affecting the team. We need to cover it. And everything went into overdrive, despite the fact that there's far more serious scandals in the AFL of people actually abusing women, you know, rape, statutory rape, misogyny, all kinds of terrible conduct that doesn't get nearly the saturation as this, which appears to be between consenting adults.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. I think part of the reason why it's been so like nonstop is there's no AFL happening, and like there's this giant AFL media ecosystem that has to like, you know, cover something. So it has just become
fill pages,
the default
fill
story.
Nothing's happening.
I wonder whether if this happened during the regular season, like it would have been a story, but it might not have gotten this much traction.
No.
Hey, Scott, just before we finish up this episode, you know, we talk a lot about the ABC. We talk a lot about, you know, what we aren't loving about certain parts of its trajectory or its slate. There is a new show that is premiering this week. It is a satirical news show. It airs tonight. We're recording this on Wednesday. By the time the episode's out, you'll be able to catch it on iView. It's a new weekly satirical show diving into the news. It's called Always Was Tonight. It is hosted by Gamilaroi man Tony Armstrong. I think it's cool to see the ABC giving news satire a go. It's been a minute since they axed Tonightly. I'm keen to watch this show. I hope it does well. I hope the ABC invests more in stuff like this. Just wanted to shout that out as an example of something good and a little bit risky, the kind of stuff that we want the ABC to be doing more of.
As someone who's been close to or even worked on some ABC TV shows that do political and news satire, I hope they absolutely go right up to the edge and even over what they might be allowed to do and push the powers that be and hopefully have a lot of success and manage to stay on the air doing it.
Yeah, good luck to everyone involved in that show and encourage everyone to give it a spin. That is it from us for today's episode. If you enjoyed the show, we'd love it if you left us a review, shared it with a friend, and you can email us questions or tips at contact@lamestream.com.au. And remember, you can subscribe to support our work at lamestream.com.au as well. Thank you to our producer Bez and our video producer Schwen. Scott, I'll see you back here on Monday.